Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. So there's a question that many educators from around the world that are grappling with, and that is, how do we better prepare young people to respond productively to the uncertainties of a changing world? What makes this question so challenging is that we don't like uncertainty. It's an uncomfortable feeling. We want to quickly get rid of it. And in the context of schools and classrooms, what we often do is we replace uncertainty with problems that have been selected by other people that are often already solved and predetermined methods, right? And what that tends to do is kind of overstructure young people's learning experiences. The benefit of doing that, however, is that you can still learn from worked examples, but it kind of puts uncertainty off to some other day. So I kind of want to spend just a few minutes we have together to kind of challenge this someday response to uncertainty. And it's a challenge my grandmother challenged me with some 20 plus years ago as I was heading off to graduate school. And so I'm a first generation college student. Both my grandparents are immigrants from Italy and Sicily. And we gathered to kind of have this sending away party where there's a lot of food, although my family didn't need a reason to gather and eat. But this happened to be the reason that day. And it was towards the end of the evening, we were all kind of circled around. And my grandmother was sitting in the middle of the circle, Alfonsina Tagle Lavore. And she called me forward. And I thought what she was going to say to me as she took my hands was, "Ronnie, we're so proud of you. First generation college student going on to graduate school." That's not what she said. She said, "Ronnie, you have such beautiful hands. Que bello, Ronnie." And I was like, "Well, thank you, Nana. I do use moisturizer if that's what you're talking about." And she said, "Feel my hands." And I felt her hands and they were riddled with calluses. And then she asked, "Don't you work, Ronnie?" And I was kind of quick, so I said, "Yes, of course I work, Nana. I work in the workshop of the mind. But I have calluses around my brain." And she said, "I think you have calluses on your kulu, your bottom." And she said, "When are you going to get off your bottom and put all this learning to work in the world? When are you going to make a difference?" And the best response I could muster was, "Someday, Nana." And then she challenged me with, "Why not now? Why not today?" Something that's kind of haunted me from that day. And so if we kind of take my grandmother's challenge and revisit that question that so many of us are wrestling with, it turns into, how can we expect young people to engage productively with uncertainty if they're never given the opportunities to practice doing so as young people? And so I think in order to kind of address that question, we have to kind of revisit our relationship with uncertainty. And yes, uncertainty is uncomfortable, and it does elicit fears, but it's also an opportunity. It's a signifier that new thought and new action is necessary. And in this way, it serves as a catalyst for a creative response rather than a someday response. So in the remaining just moments, I just want to go through the what, when, why, and how of a creative response so we can understand what that kind of looks like. So what is a creative response? Imagine a young kid in a class working on a math problem. So it's like an in-class quiz. So it's elementary school. It's a double column subtraction problem. Let's say it's 26 minus 17. Okay? And so in response, this kid writes a little poem about how you can still get gain through loss, how through subtraction you can still add beauty, and uses the metaphor of a bonsai tree as an example. Now, do you think that's a creative response? I see some people shaking their head yes. Some are maybe I don't know, some are maybe no, some maybe I don't care, I'm hungry, whatever. Okay. So, what would creativity researchers say? What we would say, I would think the majority would say, that's certainly an original response, but it's not creative. Creativity requires a blend of originality and meeting task constraints as defined within a particular context. So while that kid's response is original, that kid's not meeting the task constraints of solving that particular problem in that context. So let's consider another kid in that same classroom. Same problem, 26 minus 17. And so this kid gets the correct answer, 9. Okay? And so as any good teacher, the teacher wants to know how the kid arrived at that answer. And so it says, "How did you get that answer?" And let's say this kid says, "I added 3 back to 6 and got 9. Now that's an unusual response. Is that creative? What would creativity researchers say? Those of us that work in schools and classrooms would say, well, it depends. Oftentimes what an unusual response is could be a signifier of a creative response. It could also be a signifier of confusion. It could be a signifier of a kid wanting to willfully disrupt the lesson, which is a different kind of creativity and sometimes necessary, but we'll talk about that later. So as any good teacher, the teacher wants to kind of explore this and resist the temptation, which I've done as an educator myself, and do something like this. You know, why don't you think about that some more? Let's call on somebody else. I call that killing ideas softly, right? So this teacher doesn't do that and draws this kid's rationale out. And this is based on an actual kid's response. So this kid says, 26 minus 17. I take the 6 and 7, set them aside for a second. Now I have 20 minus 10, which is 10. I subtract 7 from that 10. That gives me 3. Add that 3 back to 6, and that's 9. Guess what, folks? That's a creative response. It's unusual, but it's also mathematically accurate in the constraints of that. Okay, so that's the what, a blend of originality, meeting task constraints. What about the when? And what about this first kid, this little aspiring poet? Do we just let this little aspiring poet languish away with this little seedling of a poet, wither and die? No. What we recognize as creativity researchers is that accomplished creators have developed the capacity to read the environment. They understand that there is a time and a place for creativity. They know when to be creative and when not to be creative. What my colleague James Kaufman and I call creative metacognition. They've kind of developed that capacity. And so sometimes it's hard for advocates of creativity to hear that there's a time and a place for creativity because we think it's so positive and it's always useful. And so I have this little thought experiment that I use to remind myself and others that there is in fact a time and a place. So imagine you're on a routine flight and the captain comes on the plane and says something like, oh yeah, this is a routine flight. We're flying over this body of water. I've been thinking about this creative water landing I'd like to break out right about now. Of course not, no way. But if the plane was in trouble, then by all means, use your creative water landing. And so again, this illustrates that there is a time and a place. And I think one of the most beautiful quotes that I've heard that kind of illustrates this is attributed to Miles Davis, the great American jazz musician. And Miles Davis says, there are no wrong notes in jazz, just notes in the wrong places. Isn't that beautiful? And if you think about that, as we think about that young kid, that poet, the little poem that he wrote, it's not that that poem is a wrong response, right? It's just a response in the wrong place. And so our responsibility would be to help that kid find the appropriate time and place to express that poetry. So that's the what and the when. The why we've been talking about. Why do you want a creative response? When you're facing uncertainty and what's worked in the past no longer works, or you want to improve upon practices, which leads us to the how. So how do we do this? I would argue that we need to present young people with semi-structured experiences. So the key is semi-structured. If you remove all structure, you have chaos. And creativity really doesn't thrive in chaos. It needs those kinds of constraints. But we don't want to over-structure experiences like we typically do. And so what does a semi-structured experience look like? I'll give you some examples. They can be very modest experiences with uncertainty all the way to much more ambitious ones. So here's a modest one. So imagine you have some math story problems. You ask the kids to solve the problem. And then the way you introduce uncertainty is unstructure a bit and say, don't just solve it in the one way that we've demonstrated. Solve it in as many ways as you possibly can. That kind of thing can generate multiple solutions. Let's say it generates 13 or more solutions in that classroom that are mathematically accurate and different. Now, that raises a really important question for us. Are we going to learn more from learning how to solve one problem 13 different ways, or 13 different problems in one way, which is the way we typically assign practice and homework problems? And the truth is probably a blend. There's probably some sort of optimal blend of the two. So that's a modest example. What about a more ambitious example? A more ambitious example are what I call legacy projects. So legacy projects are designed for students, by students, in order to make an impact in the world that makes a lasting difference. And they just have 4 simple design questions. What's the problem? Why does it matter? What are we going to do about it? And what lasting impact are we going to make? And so again, the students work through these problems. And I'll give you an example. An example would be a group of bilingual students who identify in their community there are families that are not receiving critically important health-related, educationally related, or community-related information because it's not being translated. So they develop this translation service, and they partner with community organizations and businesses to open up these lines of communication. And then the legacy component of this is that they make sure that upcoming generations take over this work, and so that the work has this lasting legacy and impact in the community as they go on and graduate. And in all cases, even in the math story problem all the way to legacy projects, Young people are able to engage with uncertainty, to sit with it, to learn how to sit with that difficulty, to generate new possibilities, to ask what if, to move from what currently is to what could or should be, to then evaluate those possibilities, prune them down, and most importantly, to take action. You can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you can't take action on it or are not willing to take action on it, it's meaningless. And I think it's through these kinds of experiences of meaningfully engaging with uncertainty and developing these productive, lasting responses that young people already are and certainly can do more of developing the kinds of calluses my grandmother mentioned so many years ago. Thank you. Questions? Yes.